Yes.
Lady Hooper, may I take you to a briefing document which you refer to in your statement at page 43 in paragraph 26.12. The document is DHSC 302871_008.
Page 43, did you say?
Of your witness statement, yes.
Yes.
That's right, 26.12.
I think you'll find that the document should be on the screen in front of you.
As well, yes.
Yes. That's just so that you can have to hand what it was that you said in your witness statement about it.
Thank you.
This is a briefing document that was provided to you ahead of a Lord's debate, either in May or June 1991. It's not entirely clear from the document which one. I just want to take you to page 3 of that document. This is about whether or not to extend the payment scheme to those people who were infected with HIV who did not have haemophilia. And what the briefing document says is this, under the heading, Arguments Against Compensation. The real difficulty over granting a concession would be to re-establish a credible ring fence to prevent any further movement towards a general system of no-fault compensation. The government has always justified its special provision for HIV-infected haemophiliacs on the grounds that they are a uniquely unfortunate group, in particular because the tragedy of infection with the HIV virus was superimposed on a severe hereditary disability. I won't go through the rest of the document, which sets out some of the reasons for seeking to distinguish those with haemophilia from those who did not have it. But is that the real crux of the matter? The argument against extending the payment scheme was because it would erode the ring fence.
Yes, the government, or the Department of Health's policy of no-fault compensation was very important, and therefore the ex gratia payment system that was established to help those suffering from haemophilia was regarded as a very special case. And I think it's true to say that ring fencing not only would protects the government from further payments, but also protects those who are within the ring fence from having the amount lessened because there are more cases involved. But the principle of ring fencing in this situation was very much dominated by the fact that it was well known that people with haemophilia had the double whammy, as it were, of having the HIV infection superimposed on their underlying illness.
If we could just go to page 4 of this document. There were a group of people, as is acknowledged here, for whom that was also true, even if they didn't have haemophilia. If we look at the second paragraph down, it says, just maintain that whole paragraph there. It talks about the double disadvantage of people with haemophilia. And then it says a similar combination of factors would not generally apply to blood transfusion cases. Those suffering from thalassemia or sickle cell anemia who require blood transfusion may claim to be doubly disadvantaged, but they would be few in number. So would you agree that for that cohort of claimants, there wasn't really any distinction between them and people with HIV, with haemophilia?
Well, it's always very, very difficult to draw a line in these situations. And because the haemophiliac sufferers were a very clearly distinct group, I think it was felt that at the time that was the important group to concentrate on, and that opening it up in any way could lead to other cases, because there were other cases of people. I think I remember the case of a woman giving birth and needing a blood transfusion, and that's equally horrific. But
A child with...
it was a question of drawing a line, yes. And sadly, wherever you draw a line, somebody falls just one side or the other, and that was it.
Can I take you to your statement? You set out, and I won't go through it all, there was a prolonged campaign through 1990 and 91 from MPs, from campaigning groups, from individual members of the public, seeking to change that policy. And I'd just like to take you to one part of a speech that you quote from Sir Michael McNair Wilson, MP. It's at page 51 of your statement. You could have on screen, please, WITN 7005001, page 51. And it's just the top section highlighted in italics. What Sir Michael said in his speech on the 12th of December 1991 in a German debate was this: I find the department's argument that haemophiliacs are a very special case, a very difficult one to follow. All these people are human beings. They have been given this dreadful virus not because they asked for it, but because of something that happened within the department. The same faith in the NHS that persuaded the haemophiliac to accept factor 8 from the NHS persuaded the 50 to accept blood transfusions from the NHS. Looking back now, do you think that there's force in that argument from Sir Michael?
Yes. Well, yes, I mean, I think everybody involved in that had great sympathy with these other cases and victims. But, as I said, the line had to be drawn somewhere. And that was the government, the agreed position and the government line.
Now, we've heard in evidence elsewhere, and I won't take you through the documents, that by late November 1991, Mr. Waldegrave, as Secretary of State, was beginning to move towards a different policy of expanding the payments. And through a minute that was sent out by Strawn Heppel, he invited ministers' comments on that. Could we have on screen, please, DHSC 302537_062. This is the response that you gave to the consultation that Mr. Waldegrave was putting forward. It's dated the 5th of December 1991. And what it says is this: in regard to Strawn Heppel's minute of the 29th of November, I think we should hold the line, however difficult this may be. I am not aware of a sudden pressure via correspondence or otherwise. So your view at that time was to maintain the existing departmental policy, is that right?
That's true, and I think that this is where those ministers who were in the House of Commons were more aware perhaps of the pressures that came from backbench MPs and from and the constituents of those MPs, and indeed of their own constituents, than perhaps again in the House of Lords, although there was also pressure in the House of Lords and from peers and so on. But at the time, I obviously, I don't remember why, but at the time, I obviously decided that it was, that we should stick to the government line, but eventually I was overruled, so.
The position that you took appears to be the same position that was taken by Strawn Heppel and indeed by the permanent secretary at the time. So you were not alone in that position, were you?
No, indeed, thank you. But it's true that also that Strawn Heppel was one of the civil servants whose opinion I respected very much, because the civil servants had lived with this issue since the incident had occurred in the early 80s, then I felt it had been thoroughly looked at and considered, and accepted that position.
As you say, you were overruled because both Mrs. Bottomley and Mr. Waldegrave were in favour of changing the position, and the position changed. But I would just like to bring up Mr. Waldegrave's response to your minute, because I think it touches upon some of the issues that you raised about the difference between being in the Lords and being in the Commons. We have DHSC 302537_056. This is a minute from the Private Secretary of the Secretary of State to your Private Secretary, Miss Bennett, who we saw referred to earlier. The date is the 12th of December 1991. The topic, blood transfusions, etc., patients with HIV. What was said on behalf of Mr. Waldegrave was this. The Secretary of State has asked me to thank your Minister for her note of the 5th of December. That's the note that we have just looked at. He has asked me to draw her attention to the attached EDM, which is an early day motion, which she may not be aware of, but it is this which seems to have started the ball rolling again. I won't take you to that early day motion, but as you say in your statement at paragraph 27.10, the early day motion now had 249 proposers to it. Could you just explain for us all what an early day motion was?
Yes, we don't actually have early day motions in the House of Lords, so I'm sure that you will get probably a better explanation from some of the MP witnesses. But my my knowledge of EDMs is that it is in effect a parliamentary petition, and a motion is put down requesting something, and the writer of the motion seeks support on very often an all-party basis in order to push this through. The numbers involved in this were clearly high numbers, and I would have thought, other EDMs that I've been aware of have been signed up by 50 or 60 people or something like that, but this definitely was a significant pressure.
Am I right to understand that early day motions are in no way binding upon the government, but they are, as you say, a way of members of Parliament marking?
It's a petition. I mean, people go to number 10 and present signatures on various issues, but this is a particular parliamentary procedure.
Now, we know that the policy changed, and I won't go through that with you. You say in your statement that you were made aware of the initial outline of the scheme that was to be put in place, but you don't have any recollection of being involved in the detail of that work.
No.
And it's also relevant to note that this was taking place in the early months of 1992, and you left the department in April of 1992.
After the elections, yes.
Finally, on this point, you say in your statement at paragraph 28.3 that you weren't surprised that the policy changed, given the sympathies of all of those concerned. It's at page 54.
Well, that seems a fairly obvious conclusion, I think. Yes. 28 point.
And when you say, does not surprise me given the sympathies of all concerned, who are you talking about? Whose sympathies are we talking about there?
Well, I don't think I've met anybody who was unsympathetic on this issue, but I suppose that I was thinking particularly of ministers who were making a change in what had been the policy.
Looking back, do you think that change should have come earlier?
Well, I think all these things were looked at and considered very thoroughly, and there was often not disagreement, but a difference of opinion. So on a serious subject like this, I can't now remember how much time elapsed actually, but I mean, it was something that had to be considered very seriously and thoroughly, and that takes time when there are other things happening as well, so that it's not as if everybody in the department was looking at the issues all at the same time.
Just so that you're aware of the timescale involved, the change in policy was announced in December 1992, and the settlement of the initial settlement in principle for the HIV litigation had been announced 2 years earlier in December 1990. That's a 2 year period. So do you think it should have changed earlier within that 2 year period?
Well, looking at it now, it does seem a very long time, but thinking back to the various issues that were being dealt with, but also the need to consider everybody's opinion and reconcile differences of opinion. I don't remember at the time being aware that I suppose I should have been more aware of the length of time that it was all taking. Because it's another issue I'm getting confused with, sorry, but no, I don't think I can add anything.
We will move on then to the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood and the question of screening tests for hepatitis C virus in blood and indeed plasma donations. Just before we go through this, I'd just like to list some of the terminology involved so that we're all aware what we're talking about. We're all referring to things in the same way. Hepatitis C virus, the terminology evolves over this period. Previously, there had been references to non-A, non-B hepatitis. By the late 80s, the growing awareness of hepatitis C being one of the causes of non-A, non-B hepatitis, you get a shift in terminology. A screening...
Sorry, what date did you say that was?
The late 1980s and the early 1990s.
Yes, I think it was in 1988 it was recognised as a particular virus, yes.
I think that's right.
Sort of sticks in my mind for some reason.
The screening test was, as I understand it, and please say if your understanding is any different, a test that was intended specifically to identify hepatitis C virus in blood donations so that those donations would not be used. There were two tests in particular that we'll see from the papers. The orthochiron test, the two companies were working together, and then an Abbott test. Does that accord with your general recollection?
Yes, I must confess I don't remember, but that I have no reason to disagree with it, shall I say.
There's also another form of testing, which is surrogate testing, which is testing for other markers which were thought to be indicative of non-A, non-B hepatitis, later hepatitis C. but weren't specifically for hepatitis C. Again, does that accord with your memory of what surrogate testing was?
Yes, I think so.
Now, surrogate testing wasn't used in the UK in the 1980s, but it was used in other countries. The inquiry in particular has heard about the fact that it was used in West Germany. Let's remind ourselves of the membership of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. Could we have on screen, please, NHBT 305043. Now, this is a minute from the fourth meeting of the Advisory Committee. It was held on the 6th of November 1989, and it's selected both in your witness statement and here because this would have been the first meeting that took place after you had joined the Department of Health. Now, it's important to note, isn't it, that you would never have seen these minutes, would you?
No, they weren't published, I don't think, the minutes.
They certainly weren't published, and they wouldn't have been brought to your attention in that raw form, as it were.
No.
If we look at the membership, we can see that the chair is Dr. Jeremy Metters, who is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Then we have the members listed there, or some of the members listed there, people who we've heard a lot about during the inquiry. Dr. Gunson, who was the consultant advisor on blood transfusion to the department. Dr. Lane, who was the director of BPL. Some eminent transfusionists, and Dr. Mortimer, Dr. Tedder, some eminent virologists as well. We then have the Secretariat, who are Department of Health officials, Dr. Raymond, Mr. Canavan, and Miss Renee. Dr. Raymond's evidence was that there would be him and Mr. Canavan and then a higher executive officer or an executive officer. So that's a more junior rank of civil servant, isn't it? Then we have the observers. They include representatives of the Northern Ireland office, the Welsh office, and the Scottish office. I should also say that Dr. Mitchell, one of the members of the committee, was from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. You also have at the bottom of that list there Dr. Pickles, the Principal Medical Officer, Dr. Purvis and Dr. Rotblatt. The last two were both part of the Medicines Control Agency. Dr. Purvis was a pharmacologist. Dr. Rotblatt had her background in haematology and research on haematology. We also just go a little bit further down, just so that we have a complete picture. We can see in the apologies that there are also apologies from Dr. Perry, again another Scottish representative, Dr. Summerfield, Dr. Tuddenham, and Professor Zuckerman. So some haematologists and another eminent virologist. That is the composition of the committee. Did you have any concerns at the time about how the committee was composed?
No.
We can see that the Secretariat and the observers, and indeed Dr. Metters himself, all have positions within the Department of Health. So they could act as a conduit, could they not, between the department and the committee?
Yes.
We've heard from others that the terms of reference for the committee included providing advice to ministers. It's right, isn't it, that this wasn't a dry, arid academic exercise. The idea was to provide you with advice so that you could then take policy decisions.
Yes.
You were the relevant minister to whom advice would be provided because blood products was within your portfolio. Is that correct?
Yes, but I think all the ministers were probably circulated.
They were, and we'll see that in the papers. But the submissions were directed to you with them copied. Is that fair?
As far as I remember, yes.
Now, there is an aphorism from around that time from Margaret Thatcher that advisors advise and ministers decide. Was that an aphorism with which you agreed?
Yes, I think it was generally agreed, and I actually also think that now, as a result of the recent pandemic, and the the role of advisors and the notice that is taken of their advice. I mean, it was currently said that we follow the science, and in these sort of cases where the science is complicated, I think most people would accept the advice that was given, but in making their decision.
We'll come on to that in just a moment. But I just wanted to put two propositions to you. That the reasons that ministers decide and advisors advise are that, first of all, there is a constitutional point that it is ministers who are accountable to Parliament. And ultimately to the country as a whole. So the whole basis of democracy is that you can get rid of ministers if they make decisions which the public do not approve of. Is that fair?
Oh, absolutely, and that is one of the reasons why ministers are not necessarily experts in the subject matter of their department, unlike in a presidential system where a president would appoint somebody who as a minister who had knowledge of the work of the department, or background knowledge, I should say, perhaps.
The second reason why ministers decide and advisors advise is a functional one rather than one about accountability. When a submission comes to a minister, it has, for a decision, it has gone through a lengthy process, has it not? It's gone through suggestions from within the department, it's gone through various drafts, it's been sent around the department to all who may have an interest. It then gets to the minister to scrutinise, other colleagues scrutinise it, the chief medical officer may be involved. It is a wide process, is it not?
Oh, it is indeed, and there may even be independent reports which influence the thinking.
The purpose of that is to try to get a wide range of views and ultimately to try and come up with the right policy, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Let's look then at a couple of structural issues.
Now, you've dealt with the first proposition, I think, which had two limbs to it, the first and the second. What's the second?
There were, sorry, those are the two propositions.
I see.
The principal reasons for ministers deciding, one is the constitutional point, they should be accountable, and the second is the functional point, it should provide for better policy, better scrutiny.
Well,
is that fair?
May I put a third proposition to you in that case? That is that the politician will have to balance what is said by one set of advisors against what is said by another. So, for instance, decide on priority of action.
Yes, certainly that, and I suppose also take into account, not particularly in this situation, but any budgetary consequences for the department.
So the minister is expected to be where the advice intersects with what that minister and that government sees as the public interest.
Sees as public interest and what is possible, yes.
Thank
you. I don't suggest that these are entirely comprehensive, but those are important factors as to why ministers should make those decisions.
Well, I think, in fact, that the accountability issue is probably the prime one.
A couple then of structural questions, which touch upon exactly the point that you raised about how a non-expert minister such as yourself, I say that meaning non-expert in the area of science, how you digest, understand, and deal with the advice that you're given in a highly technical area. First of all, this question. Policy making in these kind of fields is a journey, and there are roads which are chosen to go down and paths which are decided not to go down. Is that a fair analogy?
Say it again, please.
When you're making policy, for example, on how and whether to introduce a particular test, it's a journey, and there are different forks in the road, and you decide to go down one particular road, and that means deciding not to go down other avenues. Is that fair?
Yes.
Is it possible to set out criteria for when ministers should be asked to take a decision on the route that is being travelled?
I'm not sure where that leads us, actually, but there certainly were not criteria outlined at the time that I recollect. I'm not sure that I can answer that one, sorry.
Is it fair then to say that the minister is relying upon those who are sitting on committees such as these to bring matters to her attention so that she can then make a decision if a decision is required?
Are you suggesting that the minister should be asking for information and not just reacting to information that comes?
I'm not suggesting, I'm just trying to understand how the process works. But it would seem that because there are no criteria, and indeed I can't think of any criteria that could be applied, it becomes a matter of judgment for those on a committee such as this as to when the minister should be involved.
Yes, but I think the committee was in touch with the CMO, obviously through the deputy CMO who was chairing the proceedings. So, it wasn't just the committee of experts who would decide on the timing. I think the CMO would come into that as well as someone within the department.
Absolutely, that was my next question. Who would make that decision? So you have the deputy CMO there, you also have civil servants on the secretariat, and you have civil servants who are observers. So this isn't being conducted just by the experts, but a decision presumably ultimately would come down to the chair, Dr. Metters, the most senior of the civil servants on the committee. Is that fair?
Yes.
We have heard from others that the deliberations of the advisory committee were confidential. There are, of course, benefits to that, are there not? Frank advice can be given, commercially sensitive information can be discussed, and information that an individual might not necessarily wish to put into the public domain can be frankly expressed if the meeting is confidential. Is that a fair summary of at least some of the advantages of the confidentiality?
Yes.
There are also disadvantages, aren't there, that you won't get a degree of external scrutiny. Is that fair?
Well, I probably is, but I think there are there were outside bodies who may have been in contact with the individuals who formed the commission. I mean, I'm thinking of the King's Fund at the moment, which was a very influential body in terms of health issues. And so the thinking of the individuals on the Commission might have been more widely spread than the results of their consideration and discussions.
It seems clear from the papers as well that there is a debate going on in public about the introduction of hepatitis C testing. It's not something which is taking place in a vacuum.
And as you have already said, there were international comparisons as well.
Yes.
And liaison between the experts at an academic level could be international too. So,
in your view, given the culture of government of the time and given the types of discussions that the advisory committee were having, was it necessary for that committee to be held in private?
yes, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think as far as we were concerned as ministers, it was important that we received the information and decisions of the experts in that way, perhaps before newspapers had got onto it or something like that.
Presumably you wanted the advice to be as frank as it needed to be.
Absolutely.
The presentation, turning to the presentation of the advice that came from the committees, there is obviously a need for the committee to produce something that is clear and, importantly, digestible for a very busy minister to understand what their position is. Is that fair?
Yes.
Would you agree that there is a tendency, both with this committee and probably more widely across government, that the consensus view of the committee is generally presented to the minister? Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, that, of course, is helpful in providing clarity and it makes it more succinct, but it does have a tendency, does it not, to flatten out the discussion, if I may put it that way. So you get a consensus, you don't necessarily get all of the different elements which have gone into that consensus and the nuance that may lie behind those elements.
Maybe, yes.
At the end of this, the minister receives the advice, but all of those factors that I've just mentioned, the confidentiality, the tendency to provide a consensus view, and the decisions on when to provide that advice to you, does that make it very difficult for a minister to scrutinise and challenge the expert advice? Is it very difficult to do anything other than accept that expert advice?
Well, it's certainly very difficult, yes.
To whom would you look to help you as a minister scrutinise and, if necessary, prod away at the advice? Who could help you to do that?
Well, I would probably, I mean, I don't remember ever doing it, but I would, I think, have turned to the CMO.
We know that the CMO's there obviously has a wide range of responsibilities. It's one of his deputies who's sitting as the chair,
Dr.
Metters. Is it likely that the CMO would then defer to Dr. Metters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I may well, have considered going direct to Dr. Metters.
Dr. Metters, however, has a foot in both camps, as it were, because he's part of the committee whose advice you are now seeking to probe. Is that fair?
Yes, but that's why my initial thought is to go to the CMO and then and via him, but I mean, it would have been possible to go direct to Dr. Matters as well.
Is the short point to be taken from this that you as minister were highly reliant upon the quality of advice being brought to your attention and the decisions on the committee about what to bring to your attention and when to bring it to your attention?
Yes.
Let's go back then to this first meeting. Now, I'm going to go through some of these documents. I'm not going to ask you to comment in any way about the scientific debate that was going on. You didn't see these minutes at the time. You're not a scientist, so I won't ask for your view on that. The purpose of doing this is to see what was discussed in the minutes and then what of that was brought to your attention as minister. If we could turn, please, to page 4 of this document, we can see the discussion that took place at this meeting. Just to remind ourselves, it's the 6th of November 1989, about non-A, non-B hepatitis, as it was styled then. And it says, Dr. Gunson spoke to a paper and summarised the meeting in Rome to discuss chiron testing. So this is HCV testing. He then sets out the conclusions of the Blood Transfusion Service Committee about that testing. And then there is an account of the discussion that followed. If we look at 28, so the feeling of the committee as summed up by the chairman, sorry, this is on the next page, page 5. The feeling of the committee, as summed up by the chairman, was that the test represented a major step forward, but that the committee need to know a great deal more about it and acknowledged the need for a confirmatory test. So that is a test to confirm the results of the first test is correct. And then if we go on to page 29, paragraph 29, the committee's feeling was that there was no case for using surrogate tests for non-A, non-B hepatitis. The Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood would support the general introduction of the chiron test if the FDA approves it. That's the Federal Food and Drug Administration in the United States. And the pilot study shows it to be feasible and non-problematic. For those reasons, it was felt that the committee should be developing an economic case, i.e. percentage of non-A, non-B that would be prevented, and any other data to support, for the department to fund the routine use of the test. Those are the views of the committee, and you wouldn't have seen those minutes at the time, so there is nothing on the face of those minutes, would you agree, that suggests that ministerial involvement is being sought on those matters at that time?
Yeah.
Let's turn to the next meeting of the committee, PRSC 301477, please. This is the 17th of January 1990. Present, again, Dr. Messis in the chair. I merely draw attention to the name of Miss Renee because we'll come back to her name in a second as part of the Secretariat. If we could turn to page 3, please. Under the heading Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis Cost-Benefit Analysis, paragraph 16, the chairman, that's Dr. Metters, invited the committee to address the question of whether the time has now come for the introduction of routine hepatitis C testing. There has been a lengthy discussion, which I'm not going to take you through. Just to give a flavour of it, Professor Zuckerman, we can see at paragraph 17, spoke to a paper, and he emphasised the problems posed by the lack of a confirmatory test and the apparently high number of false positives from the test. And he goes on at paragraph 20 to talk about keeping an open mind about other tests. If we could turn over the page, please, just at the top of the first paragraph there, the final sentence, Dr. Rotblat added that it was also her understanding that the FDA was unlikely to approve the test at this stage. Is that perhaps an example of a benefit of having these hearings or the committee meeting in confidence? Because however Dr. Rotblat had gleaned that information, perhaps from a source within the FDA, she would be more likely to be able to share it if she knows that it's not going to be published at that time. Is that fair?
Yes, I suppose so, yes.
If we could then move on, please, to paragraph 24. This is a reference to something said by Dr. Philip Mortimer, who was an eminent virologist. Dr. Mortimer felt that as the perceived risk is higher than that of HIV, we would be inconsistent in our screening procedure if we did not introduce routine testing. If we began routine use of this test, we should soon have a better test to move on to. Would you agree with me that that seems to be Dr. Mortimer saying, let's make a start with routine testing, doing the best we can with this test, and in due course, we might be able to move on to a better test?
Yes.
Let's now then turn to the summary that was provided by Dr. Metters of the conclusions. We have paragraph 29. The chairman summed up the general consensus of the committee as follows. Routine testing should not be introduced in advance of the FDA decision. Scientifically, not enough is known yet, but there is agreement that the test does detect some people who will transmit, and the overall prevalence figures of non-A, non-B following blood transfusion for the UK may be 10,000 per annum, subject to very wide margins of error. That is the summary of the discussion. And then at paragraph 30, the chairman invited members to give opinions on the actions that should be taken. The actions were that the costs should be looked at, with regional health authorities being asked to consider the financial implications. Further refinement to Professor Zuckerman's figures was suggested. And finally, the committee could give no further scientific advice at this point, but would discuss the matter further at the next meeting in April, which would be after the International Hepatitis meeting in Houston. Then finally, if we look at paragraph 35, it was agreed that in view of media interest, a submission to ministers should set out the present position and the committee's views. Just thinking back to the summary that the chair gave of the general consensus, that summary didn't make any reference, did it, to Dr. Mortimer's point that he thought that perhaps the time had come to introduce testing?
No, of course that is true, but it does show that there is a move forward in terms of deciding to bring this before ministers. So there is action as a result of it all.
Action being taken both in terms of progressing the work of the committee and bringing the matter to your attention.
Yes.
But nothing in the summary there from the chair about Dr. Mortimer's specific point that he felt that as the perceived risk is higher from that of HIV, we would be inconsistent not to introduce routine testing. Is that perhaps an example of what I perhaps inelegantly described as a flattening out by the chair of the discussion, just giving the consensus and not giving the wider discussion?
Yes, I see what you mean, and I realise that, and in one sense, I mean, I'm not sure. Have I seen this document before? I mean, it
was provided to you,
yes.
But I emphasise you would not have seen it at the time.
Not at the time. Yes. Yes.
Can I stress as well, for the record, I'm not suggesting any impropriety on behalf of the chair here.
No.
The minutes we can see from the documents were presented and were agreed at the next meeting, and the minutes were agreed by Dr. Mortimer, who was present at that meeting.
And there was nothing to suggest that he was trying to delay anything either. So, yeah.
Let's turn then to what you were provided with. This is NHBT 40189_055.
And does that come up in my witness statement?
It does, and I'm afraid it's the one
Is there a reference?
one that I haven't made a reference of as I went along. Forgive me. Thank you. 58, paragraph 58, page 58, sorry.
Page 58, thank you.
And this is 30.6. And you say in your witness statement that this is the first ministerial submission on the subject of testing to which you have been referred. And of course, you haven't selected the documents yourself. The inquiry has done that, and with the assistance of your legal team providing additional documents where they have been able to find them. But this is certainly the first ministerial submission that I have seen that went to you. And it is a response, it seems, to the final part of the minutes that we've just looked at, which said that something should go to the minister. And this is then what is provided to the minister, and we can see that it is dated the 15th of February 1990. It is from Miss Rene, and that was the name that I highlighted from the Secretariat, and it is sent to Dr. Metters and to your private secretary. It's also sent to the private secretary of the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health in the Commons, and then next to that in handwriting, all private offices, so presumably to the private offices of the other ministers as well. To Dr. Pickles, Mr. Dobson and Mr. Canavan as well. What is said in this minute is this: non-A, non-B hepatitis in blood. This note seeks to bring ministers up to date on the current situation regarding testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis, often referred to as hepatitis C in donated blood. Ministers will be aware of the recent press interest in this topic and of a number of parliamentary questions that have been raised consequently. Background. Since the middle of 1989, Ortho have been marketing a test as a method of identifying carriers of non-A, non-B hepatitis. There was no confirmatory test available at that time, and none have been produced to date, although we know that some are in development. The Department's Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, ACVSB, discussed the possible routine use of the test in the MBTS at its meeting in 1989, but decided that not enough was known about the meaning of the positive results that it produced, nor of its reliability. A pilot study using the Ortho test was initiated. Current position. At the January meeting of the ACVSB, members once again addressed the question of routine introduction of the test. The committee's decision was that there was still insufficient scientific information about the test to advise its routine introduction. Future action. In April, an international hepatitis meeting will take place in Houston, at which extensive discussion of developments in non-A, non-B testing, and the Ortho test in particular, will take place. The ACVSB, therefore, agreed to reconvene to review their decision at the end of April. Ministers will be kept informed of any further advice from the ACVSB immediately after its meeting of the 24th of April. Meanwhile, work is proceeding on an assessment of the cost-benefit of such a screening programme, which would be needed by the management executive and ministers in the event that the ACVSB favours screening. That is the minute that was provided to you following the discussion of the committee and the decision of the committee to send something up to the minister. would you agree that that minute summarises the consensus view and the action points reached at the committee meeting, but it doesn't make any reference to Dr. Mortimer's intervention?
Well, it certainly doesn't make any reference to Dr. Mortimer's intervention, and I don't recollect my thinking at the time. But yes, it seems to be a suitable summary for ministers to consider.
The fact that it doesn't have Dr. Mortimer's different voice, if I may put it that way, means that you as a minister wouldn't have been made aware that there was a member of the committee who was thinking in that way. Is that right?
Because the custom was that the consensus view was given to ministers.
It makes it harder, does it not, to challenge that consensus view if you are unaware that somebody within the committee had a slightly different point of view?
Yes, but I mean, a consensus view means that it has been finally agreed by the whole group, including whoever may have disagreed.
And I stress again, Dr. Mortimer saw those minutes.
Unless there is, unless the individual concerned explicitly asks for a minority opinion to be given. I mean, I think that's the usual way of dealing with that. So Dr. Mortimer may not have felt very strongly about it, because it would have been up to, is it a him or a her? I'm sorry, a him. Thank you. To voice that, because the whole commission, I imagine, would have been shown the summing up that Dr. Metters made.
Yes, the papers are clear that
Yes.
the minutes were agreed at the following meeting, including by Dr. Mortimer. There's also no reference in the minute that we have just looked at to surrogate testing, is there?
No.
Can we just turn to your witness statement, page 58, paragraph 30.6, which is the paragraph dealing with this section. What you wrote in your witness statement is this, about the minute. This did not mention surrogate testing. I cannot remember receiving any advice on this topic. Go to the next page, please. And have not been provided with any documents that suggest that I was. It seems that this was an issue that was not raised at ministerial level, or at least not with me. Does that remain your evidence?
Yes, I'm afraid my memory has not been jogged by seeing these documents.
It would seem then, would it not, that you're being told in this minute about the road that is being travelled by the advisory committee, but you are not being told about the road that they have decided not to travel in the terms of surrogate testing. Is that right?
That's right. But I mean, I think, again, there were international comparisons at the time, so we would have been aware of that, I think.
Would you, as a minister at the time...
I mean, not in any detail, but I mean, it was in the public domain.
It was certainly in the public domain that other countries did use surrogate testing. But you, as a minister in the UK, were not being asked whether or not that should be introduced here.
No.
That was a decision, it seems, that was taken by the committee rather than by you as a minister. Is that fair?
Well, I certainly have no recollection of making, being aware of it or of making any decision on it. So.
Do you think that that is a matter and a decision that should have been brought to you as a minister with advice but for you as a minister to decide upon what the policy should be?
Well, I think the difficulty with all of this is that so much appeared to be unknown about. Everybody wanted to find a suitable method of testing and screening blood products. But I mean, as I say, I can't remember my thinking at the time, but I felt that it was being considered and looked at, and that we would get recommendations as soon as anything viable came up.
Certainly, that was the purpose of the advisory committee, wasn't it? To do that kind of detailed research and thinking, which a minister couldn't possibly do and wasn't qualified to do.
No, I certainly wasn't.
But at the end of it, the decision on policy was a matter for ministers, wasn't it, rather than the experts?
Mm-hmm.
A policy had been introduced in other countries, including West Germany, but you weren't being asked about whether or not that should be introduced in the UK, at least according to these papers.
Apparently not. Mm.
Do you think you should have been asked, even if it came with advice that that was not a policy that they would recommend? Do you think that as minister, for all of the reasons that we discussed earlier, that is something that should have been put to you?
Well, I must say, with hindsight, I'm surprised that I didn't ask about international comparisons, because I do try always to look at what's happening in other countries and so on. So, yes, I think it could be said that the information should have come to us more speedily.
From everything that you've said earlier, this is a minute for information. It's not a minute for a decision. You're not being asked to do anything at the end of this minute. It would have been one of many papers in your boxes to take home at night or over the weekend. I'm assuming from what you have said earlier that this is unlikely to have been at the top of a pile, because there would have been pressing matters that required a decision. It's unrealistic, isn't it, to have expected yourself to have picked up on the absence of any reference to international comparators of surrogate testing for hepatitis C. You couldn't possibly be expected to have that in your mind when you were reading through this minute. It was for your officials, was it not, to bring those matters to your attention as and when they thought that the minister should either be informed or should be asked for a decision. Is that fair?
Well, I certainly think that my view, my reaction at the time would have been based on the fact that all these things were being looked into, and I respected the individuals who were involved in looking into it, and that therefore I certainly, I suppose, would have expected that if there were anything urgent or anything that really needed to be done urgently, that it would be brought to our attention. So since we were being kept informed of progress, and to some extent there was progress in bringing in some form of screening, then I can only suppose that at the time I thought it was being kept in hand.
I don't question your thinking at the time at all. The question is about should the matter
Whether-
have been expressly brought to your attention so that you could give it your attention? And that issue
Should it
is,
have been marked
should,
urgent, you mean, or something
or
like that?
should the question of whether or not surrogate testing should be introduced in the UK, should that have been brought to your attention for a decision, rather than having the committee decide that they didn't think that was a path that they would go down?
Well, when you put it like that, it seems strange that it was not underlined in some way, yes.
Just finally on this document, we can see, oh sorry, could we have a document back up, Lawrence? NHBT 40189_055. NHBT 40189_055. The marginalia at the top of the letter, you say in your statement that this appears to come from Dr. Metters, and having looked underneath that redaction, it does indeed appear to come from Dr. Metters, and so we may make an application to you to place some information over that redaction. What it says is, Mrs. Baldock, the clear advice from the ACVSB is that, as yet, there is not enough scientific data about the test marketed by Ortho for this committee to recommend that it be introduced. Mrs. Baldock, as you mentioned earlier, was your private secretary, principal private secretary at the time. The marginalia is dated the 16th of February 1990, so the day after the minute was prepared. Do you know why that additional information was added to that minute by Dr. Metters?
No. I mean, the writing, the note written at the top, you mean?
Yes.
No.
Do you think that as he was addressing it to Mrs. Baldock, his real audience was you?
I have no memory of whether this was something that I actually saw. It just is to the private secretary, so it might have, since there was no clear result to be brought to my attention, I may not have even seen it.
Thinking back to what the committee said, that they thought that it was necessary for a document to go up to a minister, do you think that makes it probably more likely that this would have been something that was flagged to be brought to your attention?
Well, it may have been. I'm sorry, I just don't have any recollection. And this may have been a time when I was very involved with the bill
Yes.
in the House of Lords, and so I regret I can't.
So I'm about to move on to a different document, next in the sequence. I anticipate that I probably have about 45 minutes of questioning left, but I wonder if it might be 45 minutes to an hour, I may say, to give myself just a bit of room. Might it be a convenient time to take a break now?
We've got to lunchtime, haven't we?
We have, yes.
And lunchtime is normally a good time to have a break. So we'll take a break now until 2 o'clock, and then come back and complete the questions which you have for the Baroness. So 2 o'clock.
Thank you.